Hi there, welcome to Urbinary, the podcast cataloging the everyday and extraordinary in the city.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Urbinary. I'm Shidsa, and today I've got Bahar right here with me for our discussion. Bahar is studying urban planning and policy design at Politecnico di Milano, and together we will dive deep into modernist echoes, balancing history and progress in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. And we are thrilled to have Karolina Pieniazek join us. Karolina is a young Polish architect and a recent graduate of the Politecnico di Milano, majoring in architecture and urban design. She's just taking her first steps toward a real career after completing several internships and gaining additional experiences in Poland, Romania, Nepal, and Italy.
Absolutely, Shidsa. Karolina has been rocking it with some truly fascinating work lately, and she also graduated with honors. We're really excited to engage in a compelling conversation with her today.
Yes, last December she defended her thesis, Panoramic Cinema, a typical Soviet Palace of Arts in Tashkent, reservation project reviving hidden modernist features. She focused her work on Uzbekistan's capital, whose colonial period overlapped with the city's modernization.
That sounds like a very cool topic.
Indeed, and very important actually. I think honoring the urban heritage not only enriches our present but also future urban landscapes. So let's dive into the captivating narrative Karolina has to share.
Urbinary.
Hey Karolina, a warm welcome. We are truly excited to have you with us on Urbinary.
Hi there, and thank you so much for your kind words in the introduction. I'm really happy to participate in this podcast series.
Thank you. Karolina, can you share what inspired you to explore this particular topic?
Sure. I think in my case, when choosing the topic, I was guided by simple curiosity. As you mentioned, I'm from Poland, which shortly after the end of World War II belonged to the so-called Eastern Bloc for over 40 years. This time was primarily a period of reconstruction after the war, but also of modernization of the cities. New concepts of modern architecture were also developed. Then, during my bachelor's studies in Poland, I had the opportunity to go to Bucharest in Romania, which was also under communist rule for many years. It was many years ago, and I don't remember much of it anymore. But what I remember the most are the monumental abandoned buildings that I passed every day on my way to work. Then I wondered why the city couldn't use them in some way, why they're abandoned. So somehow I had already noticed this phenomenon where certain buildings in Poland and then in Romania were abandoned with no prospect of bringing them back to life. And then 2 years ago, when I was already studying in Milan and the time had to come to choose the topic of my master's thesis, I knew that I would like it to be about architecture of post-Soviet period. Then I got an opportunity to deal with this topic using the example of Uzbekistan, and I took advantage of this opportunity to expand my knowledge on the topic, which kept me interested for so many years.
That sounds wonderful. We're happy you've got the chance to work on a matter that for so long has been in your interest. If you're ready, let's jump right into the topic and explore it further.
Urbinary.
Karolina, what is Soviet modernism and how did the Soviet planning impact the physical infrastructure and the urban fabric of Tashkent city?
It is a bit difficult for me to briefly explain what Soviet modernism is, but as we can guess, it refers to the Soviet era. However, it seems to me that this concept has become very polarized. Some called it a style, others called it a certain approach in which modern socialist buildings and cities were designed, often promoting integration, modernization, and social control. In the case of architecture, it had a certain aesthetic and was often based on prefabrication. There was omnipresent standardization in both city planning and buildings, which means that they were often simplified so that they could be easily, cheaply, and quickly replicated anywhere. However, I cannot fully agree with this definition, and I think it is important to point out the outset that yes, everything I said at the moment ago is true, but not only that. Planning and building in the former Soviet Union was not neither entirely centralized nor uniform, but a very diverse, complex, and regionally specific phenomenon. Even though generally the sector was based on standard projects, many were developed as a unique exceptions. They were innovative, In other words, Soviet modernism in Uzbekistan will not be entirely characterized in the same way as in the other former Soviet countries, even though we can find many principles that connect all of these cases.
Reflecting on the interesting things Karolina told us regarding Soviet modernism, it strikes me how essential it is to unravel the different layers of this complex phenomena. Because the discussion underscores not just the concept of a polarized interpretation between viewing it as a style oriented attempt versus an approach rooted in socialist ideals and urban fabric, but also how diverse and context related this topic can be.
Exactly, but staying with Uzbekistan and more precisely Tashkent, the Soviet vision of modernity and subsequent implementation had a clear impact on the city, architecture, and even society, as I mentioned before. However, the main elements of planning impact on the urban fabric were the development of the city and the gradual displacement of the old fabric with the new one. And I don't mean here just the buildings, but also the development of the road infrastructure, the construction of the metro, or planning of green areas and their inclusion in the areas of the city center.
So you mean that cities were planned in a Soviet or European way, which was much different than what was originally available in this part of Asia?
Yes, and the organic fabric of the city with the dense development of small buildings that in Uzbekistan is called makalas slowly have been replaced with the rationally planned district of modern blocks of flats on a much larger scale. Narrow streets were replaced by wide multi-line avenues, etc.
Intriguing. What were the significant obstacles for the Soviets regarding the integration of their policies, and how did the efforts to preserve the city shape its cultural identity?
I think the biggest challenge for the Soviets in the early and the mid 20th century was first to develop a strategy on how to modernize the city. What I mean is that the Soviets could have acted in very different ways towards than existing settlements. For example, they could have carried out complete extermination, which would mean the complete conquest of the settlement by raising it to the face of the earth. Or they could have also achieved it without mass destruction, but rather focusing on gradual displacement of the center of the settlements with the Soviet modern architecture and planning principles.
So you mean they could start their intervention from the inside and gradually the city's destruction and redesigning towards the outside?
Yes, Shitsa, exactly. And there was also a third option, which was to implement a new city, new settlement outside the boundaries of the original old city and very slowly implement the new structure into the old fabric, but starting from the outside. And that was the case of Soviet approach to Tashkent. For a long time, there were two independently developing cities until they began to function as one. But what was interesting to me about how the Soviets envisioned merging these two settlements was that almost every master plan they made in the past assumed that the old settlement would eventually be completely demolished and replaced with new Soviet buildings. Nevertheless, in the Soviet colonial policy, there was a space for preservation. In fact, there were already institutions dealing with the protection of the monuments. A good example, in contrast to Tashkent, can be, for example, the city of Bukhara, which decided to preserve the old town despite dynamic modernization.
Pondering on this makes me wonder how these strategies were not merely about urban planning or architecture or aesthetics. It was fundamentally about negotiating the balance between implementing a new social order and the preservation of historical and cultural continuities. This duality transcends simple narratives of destruction and construction.
Very interesting observation, Bahar. Yes. So, Carolina, what you are saying is that a similar idea toward urban heritage preservation had never been initiated in the case of Tashkent?
In the 1930s, also in Tashkent, a similar idea for the preservation of the old city was discussed, but eventually this idea was rejected. And in fact, it only came back and discussed again in the 1970s, so 40 years later. From that time, we can notice the development projects of Tashkent, where the city tried to preserve medieval fabric, or rather, what was left of it. Unfortunately, they didn't manage to preserve much, but still, the case of Tashkent to me is interesting because it really represents the complexity of issue of the modernization where the topic of preservation is discussed from the very beginning.
Can you elaborate more on why this was a complicated case?
Uh, as I've mentioned before, the Soviet method of colonization of Tashkent was a very slow implementation, which in theory could have given a chance to implement a new city fabric into the old one while preserving a certain fragments of the old city. But everything changed when the earthquake occurred in 1966. Its effect was the destruction of mostly traditional Uzbek houses within the old town, while modern buildings were preserved almost untouched. So, as you understand, modern architecture became a kind of symbol of durability. So, as a result, the earthquake became the ultimate trigger for further modernization and simply speeded it up.
Interesting. And yet, not the first time in history that a natural disaster has been the initiator of drastic changes in urban planning. What happened after the earthquake there?
Right after the earthquake, extraordinary dynamics of new construction took place in Tashkent, mostly because around half of traditional Uzbek architecture didn't survive this event, and they had to be quickly replaced by the new housing for the citizens who lost their houses. Since then, until the collapse of the Soviet Union, Tashkent was gradually losing its old city fabric. New buildings and housing estates were being built within the boundaries of the old city, and its modernization was generally progressing. However, I would like to emphasize here that despite the earthquake, which was an opportunity for the massive development, the development of the city continued slowly and gradually. The earthquake was an unforeseen event that completely changed the Soviet narration of Tashkent, and all plans for preservation fell by the wayside.
Carolina, your work concerned a panoramic cinema. What significance did it have for the developing modernization of the city?
The panoramic cinema was one of the first modern buildings in Tashkent. As I've mentioned earlier, the Soviets wanted to connect the old and the new town. They aimed to achieve this by building a direct road connection between them. So I know that it's complicated, but try to imagine a situation where there are two cities divided by a river on the eastern side and the other on the western side. One of them is original Uzbek settlement and the other is the Soviet city. You try to connect them, so you design two roads parallel to each other, which in effect they define a plane between these 2 points. This plane, defined by these two roads and two ends, so two centers representing two different cultures and values, becomes a connector. In the center of this connector, there was built the former Palace of Art with a panoramic cinema. So, in short, the panoramic cinema, as one of the first public buildings in Tashkent, was supposed to familiarize the Uzbeks with the concept of socialist culture and modern architecture. And what I think is important here is that even though the urban and architectural concepts were at first glance modern, as in the international definition, if we take a closer look at the panoramic cinema, we can notice very interesting attempts to combine modernity with the context of Tashkent, and I mean both geographical and cultural. The same can be said about many other modern buildings in Tashkent built during the Soviet period.
How would you describe the current interaction between the historical and the post Soviet urban fabric? Or what approaches are the city authorities employing to navigate this interaction? And are there any notable challenges or threats they face in the process?
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. Until the end of the Soviet period in Tashkent, in the area that I had a chance to investigate during my work on my thesis, I identified 7 architecturally unique buildings from the Soviet period. 3 of them, so the Palace of Arts with the panoramic cinema, then a complex of hotel with a theater and a television center, constituted an urban layout. After the fall of the Soviet Union, only these 3 buildings survived, well, in various conditions, but they survived. The others were simply demolished. And now you are probably wondering why. I don't know why. I haven't found any sources that would answer this question directly. Nevertheless, there is a certain problem with the architecture of this period. Their protection is often considered difficult. It is not just a Tashkent problem that the society has often wanted to demolish these buildings as if they could erase some of the inconvenient history, which in this case is rather the issue of being directly influenced by the Soviet Union and being its colony. Nevertheless, the demolitions and discussions about demolitions have taken place and continue to take place in many places around the world. They are considered as a global problem that is increasing.
What an interesting paradox. It's as if, in one hand, these structures stand as witnesses to a bygone era embodying the aspirations, ideologies, and the aesthetic sensibilities of the Soviet period. On the other hand, their continued existence amidst widespread demolitions raises profound questions about what we choose to preserve and what we choose to erase and why.
Totally. Totally. To understand the changes that happened in the fabric of the city after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in my work, I firstly analyzed historical maps of the part of the city that was the connector between the old and the new center. So, the part that I mentioned before. And initially, the results surprised me because analysis showed that until 2004, the original old town fabric still existed. Later buildings, including modern buildings, formed a kind of frame for it. They surrounded this fabric along the main avenues connecting both centers, which is very interesting because perhaps that would have been the first step to define the quarter to be preserved as a district in the concept of, for example, an open air museum or something this kind. In 2012, many of the buildings, including the modern and particularly unique ones I mentioned before, were demolished. And today, the demolition hasn't stopped. The entire complex of traditional Uzbek buildings have been demolished too. Instead, a shopping center and even newer multi-family housing were built.
And the present status of this segment of the historic city?
The buildings from the Soviet times have become the oldest objects, the most historic ones, and seeing the tendency to constant demolitions, they are at risk. And I don't mean here only the buildings near the panoramic cinema, but many other unique buildings too that were built also after the earthquake. They have been undergone some modifications. They are often owned by private people who rebuild them depending on their needs. However, in the case of many of these buildings, including the panoramic cinema, there is still a chance to restore certain elements and protect them. The same applies, of course, to the old fabric of the city. So to Makalas, I believe that they should also be protected in a possibly short time.
But what has been the public's perception on this? Weren't there any contribution toward the preservation of the urban heritage? Or maybe let's say, are there any educational initiatives aimed at raising awareness about the city's urban heritage among residents? And what strategies have been employed to engage the community in the process?
I think that one of the first projects that was created, it was called Architecture of Uzbekistan Black and Red Book, which is a public list of architectural monuments of Uzbekistan destroyed by order of the authorities of various levels, which have become victims of rash actions of owners or are under threat of extinction because of state, owners, or sometimes society do not recognize them as monuments. Then, of course, there is the Foundation for the Development of Culture and Arts under the Ministry of Culture of Republic of Uzbekistan, that together with the architectural design studio from Milan called Grace, few years ago created a team to develop a strategy for the preservation of modernist architecture in Tashkent. Professor Davide Del Curto, who was my thesis supervisor, was also a member of this team, and thanks to him, I gained the opportunity to also work on this topic. I know that some other initiatives try to raise awareness about the city's urban heritage among residents. But in addition, they try to bring the debate on architecture and urban planning of the 1960s and 1980s to the international arena because, as I have already mentioned, this problem concerns many regions of the world as part of our common history, as the architecture that preceded it but also as a very important modern movement that generated many innovative ideas, buildings, and visions for the city as a whole.
It's very interesting for me that the approach towards the preservation of the urban heritage is this comprehensive act from raising public awareness and engagement to educational collaborations and also international interventions.
Absolutely. And how was the decision making process for determining the, let's say, adaptive reuse of the cinema to ensure both the historical preservation and functional relevance in today's urban context?
Very interesting question. What comes to my mind here is a statement by Ekaterina Golovatiuk, who is the founder of GRACE, so the studio that was involved in the research and the project for Uzbekistan's architectural heritage. In one of the interviews for, if I remember well, Kozark platform, she said, "We are preserving the monuments built to celebrate the socialist society and to function within it. And at the same time, we aim to make this sustainable heritage within the new capitalist condition."
I just want to add that Ekaterina's statement was very captivating for me. Shifting from a socialist to a capitalist context without compromising the integrity of the heritage sites indeed requires a delicate balance between historical preservation and functional relevance in contemporary urban settings.
I think that this statement perfectly is summing up the challenges that participated in the decision-making process for determining the adaptive reuse of the panoramic cinema by me. But I must also admit that it is this capitalist condition that is the cause of all the transformations that have been carried out in the building of the panoramic cinema. The panoramic cinema's unique architecture posed challenges, particularly in maintaining its original features while accommodating modern needs. For example, my strategy focused on reclaiming lost elements such as the transparent foyer to restore the building's character. Retaining the rotunda was also crucial for its multifunctionality, including panoramic projections, which other Soviet palaces of arts didn't have.
Fascinating. So, its uniqueness as the only former panoramic cinema in the former Soviet Union adds to its urban importance even beyond Tashkent. Okay, but here I would like to ask something. Reflecting on the situation in Tashkent, not my personal opinion, but some urbanists might argue that excessive focus on historical preservation suffocates innovation in urban design. I would like to know, how do you respond to the criticism that preserving the, for instance, panoramic cinema might impede the development of more contemporary and innovative projects?
Well, Shitsa, once again, very interesting question. Um, Let me start from the point that Uzbekistan is the youngest and the fastest developing country in the post-Soviet area. Therefore, a lot of things are happening there now. However, the example of the parts of the city that I analyzed clearly indicates that the problem is not the preservation of the city, but the uncontrolled replacement of old buildings with others. Therefore, work related to protection is so important. And by protection, I mean to protect what is still possible because many objects are no longer there. While working on my topic, I realized that the modern times and the uncontrolled dynamic development of the city are a great threat both to monuments and to the buildings from the end of the previous century, which are already being discussed to be included in the more sustainable protection framework. However, in my opinion, in the case of Tashkent, we cannot talk about excessive focus on preservation because preservation is a relatively new initiative there. In my opinion, so far, there has been a much greater focus on innovations and development. Nevertheless, I don't believe that these two issues should be considered separately. Also, I think that the preservation of the panoramic cinema is somehow related to the innovation, but the innovation of the past. Often, the post-Soviet legacies have represented a movement that generated many innovative ideas, buildings, and vision for the city as a whole. These projects were never related to the past, but were always projected into the future. Therefore, if we talk about innovation, I think that this is very interesting that these projects were very innovative at the time, and in some cases, they still are.
Urbinary.
Tell us, Karolina, Wearing hats in both architecture and urban design, what role and style do you see yourself aiming for down the road?
Shidsa, I see that you really like to ask me difficult questions, so this is another one. I cannot imagine designing architecture without taking into account urban issues. And so far in my career, I've managed to combine it, and I don't feel like I have to choose or define whether I am architect or urban designer. So let's say that I would like to stay that way without a label. And in the future, I would like to be a professional who combines research and design, and I truly hope that I will succeed, but life will show.
Urbinary.
Thanks for joining us today, Karolina. And for our listeners, stay tuned for our last episode with Tommaso and Michela, who will be in conversation with Michelangelo Fusi. And in our final episode, we will maintain the focus on the governance aspects of urban planning. But this time, Tommaso will engage in a conversation with Michelangelo about the competition for national funds as an administrative and technical innovation boost for municipalities. A middle-sized Italian city will serve as a case study to explore the direct and indirect effects of participating in funds competition. Stay tuned for our insightful final episode. Urbinary is produced in collaboration with Poliradio, the official radio channel at Politecnico di Milano.
Urbinary, the podcast cataloging the everyday and extraordinary in the city.